So thank you for giving me an opportunity to share with you some of the work that we've been doing in the lab. So as we all know, there's lots of different ways to kill bees. They have parasites, pathogens, management practices, pesticide exposure, loss of flowering plants in the landscape, and climate change. And my lab spent several years studying how these different stressors were influencing bees at the molecular, physiological, and behavioral level. And a couple of years ago, we decided that instead of just describing how these things were influencing bees, we wanted to understand how we could make bees more resilient to these different stressors. And what we found was that when bees were exposed to these different stressors, at the molecular level, we saw changes in genes that were involved in metabolic and nutrition response pathways. And if we provided bees with a pollen-based diet, they were more resilient to these different stressors. And this was the case for pesticide exposure, parasite exposure, and Gloria de Grande Hoffman has also shown this for virus infections. And so what that would suggest then is that if we could improve the abundance and diversity of flowering resources in the landscape for bees, we could make our bee species and our bee communities more resilient to these different stressors. So the first part of my talk today, I'm going to focus on our studies looking at how we identify the plants that are best for supporting different kinds of bee species and different bee communities. So the first set of projects that I'll tell you about were done by Anthony Vaudot when he was a graduate student in the lab. And Anthony was interested primarily in how pollen-based nutrition was influencing the foraging decisions of bees, and in particular bumblebees. And when he considered what was in pollen, the two main macronutrients that bees get only from pollen are their proteins and their fats. And so Anthony looked at the foraging patterns of bumblebees to a selection of native perennial plant species. And what he found was that the bumblebees increased their foraging effort to plants that had higher protein lipid ratios in their pollens. And they seemed to prefer about a 4-to-1 or a 5-to-1 protein lipid ratio. He then, with the help of a lot of different collaborators, analyzed the protein lipid ratios of 82 different plant species. And this is summarized here. And you can see that the protein lipid ratios range from very low to very high. He also looked at the protein lipid ratios of the pollen brought back by different bee species. And so bumblebees, again, had a 4-to-1 ratio of pollen that they preferred to collect in the landscape. Osmia orchard bees brought back about a 3-to-1 ratio, and honeybees brought back about a 1.5-to-1 ratio. So what this would suggest then is that bees are selecting in the landscape different nutritional profiles of plants, and so they're partitioning out of the floral resources according to their different nutritional needs. As a follow-up to this study, current graduate student lab, Michaeli Krohn, was looking at how bees responded to pesticides when they're fed these different diets. And this was focusing specifically on honeybees. And what we found was that bees that were fed these low protein lipid ratio diets, so 2-to-1 ratio, had much higher survival when exposed to pesticides than bees that were fed these higher diets, including the diets that the bumblebees preferred. So this would suggest that, again, the bees are somehow partitioning out the floral resources according to their nutritional needs. So this focus was primarily on native plants, but we're also interested in looking at ornamental plants because these are really important in suburban and urban landscapes. And this was work that was led by Emily Erickson, who just graduated from the lab with her PhD. And Emily was looking at annual and perennial ornamental plant species, and I'll focus on her perennials work for this particular talk. So she looked at 5 different perennial species and 5 cultivars per species. And you can see that they vary a lot in their shape and their color. And she also found changes or differences in their scent and their nutritional rewards. They also varied a lot in terms of the types of pollinators that they attracted and the abundance of those pollinators. So even within one given species, you can have a lot of variation in terms of how many and what kind of pollinators these plants were attracting. When she looked at what it would be like to create a community with these plants and selecting only a handful of plants from this group, what she found was that if she selected the 6 most attractive plants that attracted the most pollinators and the most diversity of pollinators, and this was specifically focusing on the bee species, she could attract 80 different bee species, or almost 80 different bee species. And many of these were specialist bees and rare bees. If instead she picked the 6 least attractive plants, that would only support 20 bees in this network. And so again, this shows you how important it is to be very careful when you're selecting your plants, especially if you have sort of limited time and resources in which to create these pollinator habitats. So given that we do have limited time and resources, it would be very helpful if we could understand what our landscapes were offering for pollinators in terms of their quality, so that we could know which landscapes need additional inputs and which landscapes maybe are already doing quite well. And so this is sort of the motivation behind our beescape project, which is a large project involving a lot of different collaborators from different universities. And the basic premise behind this is that when we look at our landscapes, they can vary a lot in the land cover classes and also the configurations of these landscapes. And so in this particular location in Pennsylvania, if we had an apiary at this site, a honeybee could actually visit all of this range during her foraging trips. And so we really then want to understand, how do we know what that bee is experiencing in this broader landscape when it's kind of at a scale that's hard for us to assess. And so we wanted to provide a resource that would allow people to understand the quality of the seasonal floral resources available, the nesting habitat that's available. And these 2 indices were developed by Eric Lonsdorf using an expert opinion to assign these scores to different land use categories. We also looked at the toxic load of applied insecticides in landscape, and this was developed by Maggie Douglas when she was a postdoc in the lab. She's now an assistant professor at Dickinson College. And we're also going to be soon adding in economic value of pollination services to agricultural crops. And this work was done by Alex Jordan when she was a graduate student with our collaborator, Vikas Khanna. And so just to kind of give you some background into the insecticide index that Maggie developed, she took data that came from multiple different databases on land use patterns, pesticide application, and toxicity of those different pesticides to bees, and integrated all of this to basically allow us to say that, in a given type of crop in a particular state, we know what the average insecticide use patterns are. So how many pesticides and at what quantities are being applied. And we can then use that to calculate out the toxic load, the aggregate toxic load to bees. So the insecticide index basically tells us that how many bees would die if all drops of pesticide that were put on those fields actually touched a bee, which we know is not accurate. Not all the pesticide will come in contact with bees, but this gives us a general sense of what is going on in the landscape. And so by mapping this out, this allows us to find areas of high and low quality, so areas with low pesticide input versus high pesticide input. And we can also see how the landscape quality has changed. And so, for example, this is a map that shows you the overall toxic load. You can see in some regions of the country, it's very low, and other regions it's very high. And then we can see how it's changed over time. And again, there's been some dramatic increases in the Midwest and Great Plains. And we can maybe talk about this during the question and answer period, but this is pretty much due to neonicotinoid seed treatments on corn and soy, which has really increased the toxicity in this area. So how does this all get put together into beescape? So we developed this app that you can look at on your computers if you go to beescape.org, and essentially you can find the location that you're interested in the map and drop pins at the different sites that you want to compare. So this is State College, this is where Penn State is and where I live. And we've selected a residential area, an agricultural area, and a more natural area. And for each of these, then we get a score for the nesting index, the insecticide index, and the spring, summer, and fall floral communities. And if you're in the app, you can hover over these scores to see what their rating is. Is this low? Is this medium? Or is this high? You can also overlay the land cover classes here. And so you can see what crops are being grown. And you can sort this according to these different indices. So you can find the places that have the highest or the lowest of these particular index scores. So beescape took a lot of work to put together and involved a lot of different layers of data. But we are now sort of embarking on trying to understand how people actually use beescape. So how do beekeepers and conservationists and growers use beescape? What tools do they find most useful? What tools are missing? And importantly, we want to understand how different stakeholders evaluate the quality of their landscapes for bees, so that we can design our index to really capture the things that they most care about and potentially the bees most care about. So this is work that we're doing in collaboration with Anthony Robinson and Patrick Dudas at Penn State. And so just to give you an example of some of the early phases of the study, so Anthony ran a survey with beekeepers to have them use beescape and then provide information on their experiences. And what they found was that thankfully they found beescape was easy to use, but they would not use it very often. It's sort of like a single use kind of system because there's not that much information in it yet. And so we're now working on trying to add more temporal and spatial resolution so that people can get more information out of it. They also said that it did help them understand the quality of their landscape for bees, but they didn't really think that it matched their past experiences. So again, this is something that we're trying to dive into more detail now, is try to understand what they think is important for their landscapes. And one thing, for example, is that bees get a lot of their nectar, which they make into honey from flowering trees, and that's not necessarily being captured very well in our current forage index. So the goal with beescape was to allow for us to predict landscape quality, but also ultimately to integrate these into models of bee health, so that instead of just getting a score for foraging resources, you would get a score for how well your bees would overwinter in a particular location, or what your diversity of your wild bee community would be. So in this last section, I'm going to tell you about several studies that we did where we modeled different bee health metrics according to these index scores, as well as other parameters in the landscape. And the first study that I'll tell you about was led by DJ McNeil, who is a postdoc in the lab, and he is now an assistant professor at UNC Wilmington. And this was in collaboration with Professor Heather Hines, who's at Penn State. And so for this study, DJ and a cohort of undergraduate research assistants were sampling across Pennsylvania at different sites for wild bumblebees. And so then those samples were taken back to the lab and processed to look for parasite and pathogen infections so that we could calculate a disease load. These sites were selected so that they cross the state, but they also cross different levels of honeybee colony density, different layers of insecticide toxic load, different amounts of spring, summer, and fall floral resources, and also variations in forest cover. And what DJ found was that the disease index, so the total cumulative disease index in these wild bumblebee samples, increased as the density of honeybee colonies in that area increased. The disease score decreased in areas that had more floral resources, and it decreased in areas that had more nesting habitat. So basically, as the quality of the surrounding landscape increased, the disease load decreased. But as we know, honeybees can cause spillover of viruses into these populations. So as there are more bee colonies in the background, we had more spillover. Interestingly, there was also these correlations with latitude and longitude, which we think might be associated with variation in microclimate in these regions, but we didn't really have enough sampling density to look at this in more detail. The second study that I'll tell you about was done by Melanie Kammer when she was a graduate student in the lab, and she's now a USDA SciNet postdoc fellow. And so for this study, we took advantage of Sam Droge's wonderful data set, which includes sampling from across hundreds of sites in the Mid-Atlantic over about 11 years. And so Melanie took these data and she did some integration and synthesis of it. And the data set itself is available for download and use for folks who want to use this to answer other questions. So when Melanie looked at this data set, what she found was that there was clearly a spring community of bees that was made up of one set of species of bees, and then a summer community that had a different subset of bees. And so when she did her analyses, she used the spring and summer bees communities separately. And so she looked at the impacts of landscape quality. So these are these index scores as well as other types of scores, climate and topography. So in total, there were 38 different variables that went into this analysis. And she did this analysis using random forest models, and this was in collaboration with Sarah Gosley, who's at the USDA ARS. And what she found was of these 38 variables, weather and climate were the primary drivers, and spring and summer bee communities had distinct responses. So just an example of some of the strongest effects in areas where there was increasing precipitation, there was reduced spring bee abundance, and in areas where the temperature was hotter in the summer, you had reduced summer bee abundance. So this would suggest that there's maybe reduced foraging opportunities, like if it's raining a lot in the spring, the bees can't forage, or potentially reduced plant floral resources. So if it's very hot in the summer, then the plants might not flower as much or as long. The second study that we did was looking at honeybee winter survival, honeybee colony winter survival, and this was using data that was coming from the Pennsylvania State Beekeepers Association. So they have been collecting data over many years, and we asked them if they could also include GIS locations of the apiary sites, and they very kindly did this, which allowed us to then conduct this analysis. And this was looking at 36 different variables, again, going across a range of weather, climate, land use, and management. We found that managing for Varroa was the most important thing a beekeeper could do to keep their colonies alive, but most of the beekeepers in our study did manage for Varroa, so we only looked at those colonies. When we looked at those, what we found was that, again, weather and climate seemed to be particularly important. So if we looked at growing degree day, which is sort of a measure of how hot and how long the summer is, in areas with cool, short summers or long, hot summers, survival was reduced and survival was best in these sort of median areas. And in areas with very little rain or a lot of rain in the summer, again, there was reduced survival. So there seems to be this sort of Goldilocks phenomena where too high or too low in the previous summer results in less survival of our colonies. So again, this might have something to do with foraging resources. The last study that I'll tell you about explicitly looks at honeybee colony growth, which is a measure of the floral resources in the landscape. So how much nectar are they bringing in to their colony? And this work is being led by Gabriella Quinlan, who's a postdoc in the lab, along with many, many collaborators who have been collecting data over several years and several states using these automated hive scales. So these track the weights of colonies on 15-minute or 1-hour intervals throughout the course of the experimental study. And what Gabrielle has found is that in these different regions, you have sort of a consistent honeybee colony growth pattern where there's an increase in the early summer, sort of a slowdown in late summer, and then potentially an increase in the fall if there's an area with a lot of goldenrod. So she focused just on this sort of early summer increase to try to understand what might be driving that. And again, she looked at a number of different variables to see what was important. And what she found was that the climate variables were, again, the most important. So areas that had wetter or warmer seasons in the previous seasons, the previous autumn, the previous winter, and the previous spring had less growth. And what's interesting is that these colonies were experimental colonies that were put out in the early summer. So they were not actually personally experiencing these things. So these influences must be happening to the actual plant communities and not to the colonies themselves. She also found that colonies that were in areas with more grassy herbaceous land in the surrounding landscape grew more, and colonies in areas with more forest grew less. And so modeling these things together, what she found was that, again, in areas with sort of drier and cooler climates, there was overall more growth than areas that were wetter and hotter. But as you increase the amount of herbaceous plants in the landscape, you can somewhat offset the negative effects of these climate conditions. So you can regain some of these growth as you increase that amount in the landscape. So overall then, I hope I've convinced you that we have a tremendous need to understand what kind of plants, types, and species are important for different pollinators in urban, ag, and natural areas. And actually some of the work that Emily's done has shown that some of these ornamental plants, rather than restricting the number of pollinators that can visit, can actually increase the number of pollinators that visit. So we can potentially breed plants to support broader pollinator communities. The effects or outcomes for pollinator species and communities are influenced by the surrounding weather and landscape. And so how do we develop a tool that can be useful? Beescape is a great prototype, but I think we can do better and make something that also includes weather predictions to help people better understand how to manage their bees or their landscapes. And then how do we mitigate these weather impacts? So can we adjust our planting schemes or our landscape configuration to compensate for some of these negative effects? And with that, I think I've thanked most of the folks in the lab that contributed to this work, and I thank our funding agencies, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today and for your interest in all things pollinator. I am Olivia Carril. I'm a scientist who specializes in studying native bees and the flowers that they visit. And today I'll be discussing the health of native bee populations in North America and speculating on their future and how to incorporate more people into understanding our bee populations. Just as a quick refresher of native solitary bees, these are those bees that live throughout North America that pollinate most of our native wildflowers and help out with a good chunk of our agricultural crops as well. They live solitarily, so this means that each female builds her own nest, often in the ground, and in it she puts provisions for her own offspring. So there are no queens at home laying eggs while workers are off gathering pollen and nectar. Each female, in essence, acts as both the queen and the worker. There are no hives, and there's no honey. Bees actively gather pollen from flowers. They're one of the few insects that do, and this makes them efficient and very effective pollinators. And many species can live in an area together. So my backyard may have an easy 24 species that reside in or near it, each of which can be seen flying at some point during the year. In this way, they're kind of similar to flowering plant communities where many flowers may occur with each blooming at a different time during the season. And there may be significant turnover or change across the landscape, like between my backyard and my neighbors, or even between years in my own yard. The difference, of course, is that the bees move. This adds a little challenge when it comes to trying to figure out who is in the area. So since the goal today is to discuss native bee populations, I should start by defining a population. For today's purposes, a bee population is a community of bee species that co-occurs in an area. It could be my backyard, some other habitat, a landscape patch, bee house, you name it. But some component of this may change over time or over the season. There are several ways to characterize a population. At its simplest, of course, we can describe it according to the number of species that are in an area. So if we're imagining that this is my backyard, hopefully there's more than this in my backyard, I would say that there are 7 species that live in that area. Of course, I can add on to that also the number of individuals for each of those species. So in this case, Anthophora petrophila has the lowest with 5 individuals, whereas Lasioglossum albifrons I put as having 120. And it can be further characterized by changes in the area over time. So here you can see that a bee called Diadasia diminuta had 12 in 2010, but was absent in 2011. And as we can see that even though that bee apparently went down, I've made all this up, but just to give the point, Hylaeus affinis started with 76 in 2010 and became much, much more abundant in 2011. Moreover, we can characterize our area by how unique it is across space. So does it have the same number of species in my yard as there are in my neighbors next door? Do we have the same number of individuals for different species, or is there significant change from place to place? So what do we know about bee populations in North America? Well, of course, not as much as we want to. As a scientist who's always curious about bees, it might be that my answer will always be not as much as we want to, but we do know enough to kind of establish some general patterns. We know that east of the Mississippi River, there's roughly 770 species. And if we look at how bees are distributed across North America, we can see that bee richness tends to be at its highest in the desert Southwest. This map is one I made based on records from museums and published papers, and it isn't entirely complete, as you can see, but it does at least give a sense of bee species richness for each region and for most states. Also, at the broad scale, we know that there are between 20,000 and 30,000 species around the world, and between 3,500 and 4,000 occurring in the US and Canada. This diversity in bees and other pollinators is a result of And I think you could argue even also the cause of the extraordinary diversity in flowering plants that we see in pretty much any ecosystem around the world. So considering that both managed and wild insects are such important pollinators, it's alarming to read headlines like this recent one in the New York Times about an insect apocalypse. So what do we really know about insect apocalypses, and can we focus in on bees? What do we know about bee declines? Not very much. We don't have much in the way of quantifiable standardized data about the number of individuals in a region for each of those 3,500 or so bee species that occur here. So let's dive into one of those a little bit. I'll show you here like an overly simplified graph to try and illustrate this point. Imagine that I caught 58 individuals of Osmia aglaya last year. And since I don't know how many were in that area 10 years ago, I don't know if the population is increasing or decreasing or staying the same. Of course, other scientists have struggled with this issue too. If we don't have past quantified data, how do we establish now what our bee populations are doing? Scientists have come up with a lot of really creative ways to try and get around this lack of quantifiable data in order to tell us just something about the state of bee populations in North America. I'm going to go through sort of a review of a few of the published studies. There are others out there, all very creative, but just this is a sample. This one study looked at the list of bee species known for the eastern US prior to 1990, and then checked to see if those bees are present there now being 2009. And they found that all were, though because the study focused on presence and absence, it doesn't hint at whether any of them were more or less common than they used to be. Another study focused on just bumblebees and found that one Western species and 3 Eastern ones have had sort of precipitous population declines in the last 30 years. But they also found that some bumblebee species have become more common, both in the East and in the West. Another paper looked at changes in floral relationships over the last 120 years using this incredible data set gathered in the 1890s, and found that they have changed significantly. This is likely a result of changes in the landscape and the invasion of non-native plant species. Another study looked at pollinator guilds instead of focusing on a genus of bees or trying to look at all of them in terms of presence, absence. These guys put bees into groups according to whether they were specialists or generalists or ground nesters or a lot of other categories to see if any of them were more susceptible change than any of the others. And they did this just in the Northeast and found that specialist bees and large bees and bees with really short adult lifespans were more likely to change compared to other groups of bees. And this is a rather new paper that came out that found that while we're documenting more specimens than ever before, the number of species being recorded for those specimens is going down. So what the heck does all this mean? From my point of view, what this means is that there will be some winner bees and some loser bees. We already have evidence, of course, to suggest that bumblebee species have not fared well in recent years. And there's data indicating this might even be partly the result of climate change. It seems that some groups of bees may be vulnerable to habitat fragmentation, maybe loss of flowering resources on which they rely, perhaps pesticides, the spread of new pathogens, maybe even being outcompeted by honeybees. But the big picture is that landscape level changes of the last 75 years are the kinds that are known to be detrimental to some groups of solitary bees. What remains to be seen, and what's important to focus on with our research, is which groups of bees will struggle in the face of these new disturbances so that we can focus our conservation efforts on those bees. Or alternatively, the vulnerable bee-rich habitats that are most imperiled. This, of course, requires a huge effort to quantify bee populations and their changes in a standardized, repeatable way. Gathering quantifiable baseline data isn't as easy as it would seem. The struggle to do this in a way that's useful, that can be applied broadly, and that isn't too detrimental to the bee populations about which we're so worried is real. It's a real struggle. There's been a lot of debate back and forth about the correct way to do this. and which techniques to use and how often to sample and how to combine our efforts for greatest effort and where to focus. All of this has been the subject of many debates among researchers in recent years. But these are the kind of questions that really interest me, and I spend my summers collecting bees in standardized plots so that I can quantify changes in bee populations over the long term. And by setting up these plots now, I hope to be able to come back in 10 or 20, or maybe someone else could come back in 40 or 50 years and see how the bees have changed. I'm certain my methods aren't perfect, but they have proven useful in showing us some of the trends in bees over recent years. For example, a study in Pinnacles National Monument in California, where I collected my first bee ever, has been running off and on for the last over 20 years now. And we've been able to document changes in the bee community in this place over these years. So what we found is that overall, the number of bee species that are collected in a given year has been between about 290 and 310 in any year. But the proportion of species in common between those years doesn't change a whole lot. So on this, you can see the number as it gets closer to 1, that means that 2 years were more similar to each other in terms of their species or generic composition, species being above and to the right of the diagonal line, and generic below and to the left. And even though we're collecting the same number of species, there seems to be some sort of natural turnover that happens, and it's remained consistent across the 15 years that are shown here. A study in Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, which is in South Central Utah, and it's the one that I did for my master's, took place over 4 whole years. And because we collected with nets every 2 weeks for the duration of the flowering season across those 4 years, we were able to document bee-plant relationships and watch how they changed in this pretty natural, fairly undisturbed habitat, both across the season and between years. And we found that different plants were dominant at different times of year. So I colored the little dots in the center the same color if it's the same plant. And then as the color changes, it means a new plant sort of bloomed and took over as the season progresses for just this one plot from early May through late July, and then across 3 years, 2001 through to 2003. So you can see that the plants, of course, change across the season, but we also found that different plants dominated in different years in that same area. And what's really cool is that we were able to revisit this place in 2019, and we can now look over the long term to see how these plant pollinator networks have changed. And my hope is that it'll provide a nice sort of experimental control for comparing with areas that have experienced more substantial habitat change. Unexpectedly, my more recent work here in New Mexico in standardized plots have spanned the years during which New Mexico has experienced a mega drought. So I'm interested to document the response of the bees to this huge disturbance event over the next several years. All of my research in different regions is done with the goal of being able to document bee populations over time, providing data that can be useful to me now and also to other researchers in the future. In addition, and maybe my favorite part of being a researcher has been watching the growing interest in people who aren't trained scientists. Many people have a genuine interest in understanding bees for their own sake and identifying the place of bees in wild and human ecosystems. It's I think, pretty cool to be a part of the effort to find ways for scientists to be able to work in concert with people who in their other life are engineers and physicians and teachers and general contractors and artists. But we can all work together to find ways to grow our understanding of bee populations and do it faster than we've been able to before. Obviously, the process isn't perfect yet. Identifying bees from iPhone photos is a skill that few possess. I certainly don't do well at it, but even with those imperfections, there are some incredible side benefits that come with the blurry photos. For example, the mere interest in understanding bees that manifests as an iPhone photo can lead to healthier habitats when people plant things in order to encourage bees so they can take photos of them. And more flowering resources can end up in backyards in the middle of cities and other urban areas. It can also slow the use of pesticides until we sort out what exactly they do to all of our solitary bees. And it can lead to greater success with getting imperiled species listed so that they get the funding they need in order to be preserved, hopefully. And it can lead to a whole army of bee scientists who've put down the phone and picked up the skill set needed to go out and collect real data. And there's several very successful examples of this across the US with more to come, including, of course, the Oregon Bee Survey and some of the bumblebee and native bee surveys that are happening in Ohio. There's also a ton of other incredible efforts across the country. So I'll quit there. I'd like to say thank you for your time and for the opportunity to talk to you. I look forward to your questions.
2 Million Blossoms, my odyssey into communicating science to a wider audience. I've successfully published 8 issues, over 800 pages, all about pollinators. My goal with this quarterly magazine was to inspire, inform, and entertain. At the heart of good science communication lies good storytelling. Our minds are designed to make connections, to interpret, and to spin stories that help us explain the world around us. We've evolved as tribal communities. Around campfires, we told each other stories about how the world worked, shared information that helped us survive and thrive. Our minds soak up stories, and we retain the details far better than when we tried to learn pure facts. Research has shown that the leading science communicators in today's media-soaked world are not scientists, but entertainers. The question we must always ask ourselves when communicating is, why should our audience care? What elements of the science will hold their attention? What is the hook, the nugget of fascinating detail that will draw them in? And how do we keep dropping crumbs along the way so that an audience accompanies us through to the end? I am a honeybee scientist at heart, and what I have learned is that honeybees are incredibly resilient pollinators. They live in large colonies with workforces of 30 to 50,000 individuals. They have a reserve workforce that can spring into action when food resources become available. This extra buffer of bees helps the colonies survive stressful conditions. Solitary pollinators, in contrast, go it alone. They must forage, defend, nest, and reproduce without the support of nestmates. If they run into trouble, such as a predator, no one returns to complete the nest. They blink out of existence. We are witnessing death by 1,000 cuts, as a team of renowned scientists recently noted in a review article for a special issue of PNAS. They highlight how we have poor historical records that are biased toward important and showy species like the monarch butterfly and the rusty-patched bumblebee. There are over 20,000 species of bees worldwide, but the vast majority are poorly studied and difficult to identify, requiring specialists poring over physiological differences under a microscope. They point out that the specialist pollinators that forage on only a few species have a more limited food source, and so tend to suffer a worse fate than generalists that can adapt to other food sources. Agricultural intensification, deforestation, and urbanization are causing us to lose land at an unprecedented rate. The United States converted over 24 million acres of natural land between 2001 and 2017. Approximately 175 acres of farm and ranch land are lost every hour to make way for housing and other urban developments. The alarm has been sounded for bee losses, which up until recently was interpreted by the media and the lay public as a cry to save the honeybees. But in the last few years, the conversation has changed, and honeybees are often depicted as the downfall of other pollinators. As scientists noted in a 2018 article in Science, this lack of distinction between the declines of wild pollinators and the plight of a heavily managed agricultural species may even reduce efforts to conserve wild pollinator species, many of which are nationally or even globally threatened. Concern about honeybees has been an engine for shining light on the decline of pollinators, and has likely been important in raising awareness of pollinator declines at large. Honeybees may be necessary for crop pollination, but beekeeping is an agrarian activity that should not be confused with wildlife conservation, they note in this paper. So while some decry beekeepers and their charges for stealing pollen nectar from native bees, others recognize that beekeepers can be galvanizing forces for changes in land management policies. In a 2020 article entitled "Confronting the Modern Gordian Knot of Urban Beekeeping," the authors noted that beekeepers can create enhanced awareness among residents about pollinators and plant pollination that may promote environmental stewardship, potentially shifting aesthetic norms around lawn care. These are active residents that advocate for increases in green spaces and changes in environmental regulations. And as such, beekeepers help individuals become more aware of issues impacting the health of all pollinators, such as climate change, environmental contamination, and biodiversity loss. Beekeeping has become a very popular hobby, with the number of managed colonies increasing in recent years from 2.5 million up to around 2.8 million in the United States. However, we are still far below the number of managed colonies that once existed in the United States. In the 1940s and 50s, we had between 5 and 6 million colonies. Managed honeybees have declined, and so have butterflies. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we may have lost about 1 billion butterflies between 1990 and 2020. Since the late 1990s, the rusty patch bumblebee has declined in abundance by 87%. When we see such concomitant declines across a wide variety of species, it seems unlikely that honeybees are the culprits. Rather, the real issue is poor nutrition and lack of habitat for all. Our wild places are disappearing. In our summer 2021 issue, we ran an article on the impact of habitat fragmentation. We have cut up most of our wild places, dividing them with roads and other developments. When we chop the habitat into chunks, we create isolated islands of populations with minimal gene flow. This leaves populations at greater risk of experiencing genetic bottlenecks. The smaller populations don't include the genetic variability of larger populations, making them less able to adapt to changes like varying temperatures or reduced food availability. The way we construct our roads and beautify our developments with thin strips of trees can give the impression that there is a lot more wild habitat than there actually is. We keep losing uncultivated places, but homeowners, when added up together, own more property than our farmland and nature parks combined. If we move away from maintaining immaculate lawns and vegetation that offers no nourishment, we have the potential to create a vast network of stepping stones interconnecting habitat. In our article, Pollinator Pathways, we detail the initiative in New England to connect patches of habitat with pollinator-friendly home gardens and thus help restore an ecosystem that supports the insects and animals that help feed us. Small changes add up. Here you see an example of an urban sidewalk where the plantings were changed from a lawn desert into both habitat for ground nesting bees and plantings that provide nectar and pollen resources. Something that provided nothing to bees and butterflies now becomes a fueling station where they can tank up before moving on. By abandoning our fascination with an austere lawn and returning to the wild abundance of a cottage garden, we provide critical habitat for wildlife and reconnect with nature. Bees are vegetarian wasps. They require an abundance and diversity of plants, which provide protein-rich pollen. Unfortunately, research studies looking at plants gathered a century ago compared to today indicate that climate change is impacting the protein profile of pollen. So even when pollinators find pollen, it may be less nutritious than it was a century ago. When communicating with a lay audience, it's critical to understand and define that audience. At 2 Million Blossoms, we seek to reach garden and pollinator enthusiasts who want to feel connected to nature. 2 Million Blossoms inspires, informs, and entertains. Figuring out how to invoke important scientific detail in a way that delights the reader is no easy feat. But we've been lucky to feature the fabulous writing of Craig Childs, Rusty Burlew, Joan Miners, and many others who all managed to combine humor with decadently descriptive writing and distill difficult concepts into terms we can all understand. We don't shy away from difficult topics, such as how the import of bumblebee colonies from northern climates into more southern areas has caused intermixing and maladaptation. The southern bumblebee queens typically found their nests in the autumn, while in colder climates the queens emerge from winter and must find resources for the energy to build their nests. Cross mating can result in climatic mismatches in emergence times. And so in every issue, we feature 100+ pages of intriguing stories and gardening knowledge, all grounded in science and enhanced by stunning nature photography. Our goal is to allow armchair traveling so that our readers and listeners can venture far without ever leaving their home. The podcast complements the magazine, allowing us to conduct deep dives into topics that interest our readers. We cast a wider net with our podcasts, tackling a more diverse subject matter and all issues related to beekeeping, pollinators, gardening, and sustainability. In our inaugural issue, we featured an article by Dave Goulson on gardening for pollinators, with planting tips on what kinds of flowers are ideal for pollinators. I've made an effort to help early career scientists hone their science writing, publishing articles like this piece on why most commercially available bee hotels are incorrectly designed and how to build the perfect one yourself. We've tackled climate issues like how fire can help restore forest land and is an important part of shaping a landscape, as well as how flooding can change the bee community, moving some species to new places. Interest in monarchs never abates, and so we published a delightful piece entitled Miles of Monarchs about Sarah Dykman's bicycle tour along the entire migratory route of monarchs, all 10,000 miles by bike, as well as a jewel piece on how the monarch tags came into existence, starting one of the oldest citizen science projects, plus details on how to actually tag a monarch. We try to involve the entire family with articles aimed at younger readers, such as our piece on butterfly gardening, Raising the Next Generation. It included detailed instructions on how to rear, along with disclaimers about how these more pampered butterflies may not survive in the wild. We raise awareness for the less loved native plants, such as goldenrod. North America is home to over 130 different goldenrod species. As it blooms late in the summer, it is an excellent source of protein for bees preparing to overwinter. In North America, 15 species of bees require goldenrod to rear their young. Since our readers are predominantly based in the United States, we launched a series of regional planting advice with top 10 pollinator plant lists for different parts of the country. Photo essays transport readers to magical places and let them glimpse a different way of life. Here is an example on the stingless bees of Mexico, which are managed for honey production. This coffee table-like magazine is printed on paper from certified sustainably harvested trees using biodegradable ink and wind-generated power. It aims to provide a restful respite from the online deluge with its superb writing and eye-catching photography. We now offer collector sets of our first year and also for 2021, both of which make excellent gifts for your gardening friends as the articles are timeless. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in more information, you can find me on social media channels under these handles. Any questions?